Welcome, friends. Today we have a double bill from the late Jonathan Bowden. First up, we travel to a strange planet with explorers from Earth in what might be described as a golden age sci-fi. The second tale explores the enigmatic secrets of a daredevil escapologist. I'm Christian Bravery, and you are listening to Savage Bites. Before we get into that, if I could just urge you to hit the like and subscribe button and just tickle that notification bell, I'd be ever so grateful. Thank you so much. And with that being said, the story is entitled Foetal Planet. Part 0. The court-martial knew nothing of its dereliction of duty, occurring as it did on the last Wednesday of the month at the Space Center. The room itself was large and capacious, mounted by cosmic globes and with a polished teak table down one aisle or side. It chose to speak about its nature in a roundabout way, what with a picture of Saturn, or its moon, Titan, on a rival wall. Now and then, or through a window with blinds at the top, a space vehicle could be glimpsed. It slowed down so as to embrace the tarmac or plush lawns laid out at the astral center. These were accompanied by a gesturing ball, even a pit of correction. Behind these, the sky unfolded in delicate shades of blue. No matter how light and fluffy the clouds adorned the heavens, they were laced with a pink shimmer. Do you know? In relation to the above, long curtains of a green wove made their way to the ground, and the table was lightly sprinkled with legal papers. The odd tome propped up its axis, and these went under headings like Universal Law or Solar Navigation. Moreover, the men involved in the court appear upright, flexional, starchy, and very much there to administer discipline. Yet they wish to be fair. A few of them have cigars stuck in their mouths. One individual stood out from amidst their number, and this was Barrington Moore, Jr. He has an immaculate uniform, navigated via green silk, and contained a retinue of medals, hearts and crowns, medallions of one sort or another, and every military rank. He was an austere, balding man who lost much of his hair early on, and he evinced a natural gravitas. One of his distinguishing features is a pair of glasses, or pince-nez, that possessed a long string. Moreover, the man that they had put on trial, Templeton Morris, was stood in the central well or dock. A man of movie-star looks, certainly in his 30s, this Welsh individual is smartly dressed in a light uniform, the latter aligned to the air police. Needless to say, he wore a number of medallions, sigils, or planets around his upper jacket, and these ramified with his black tie underneath. His hair was brushed back straight, although signs of strain were showing, such as those that create grey hairs. His offence was aborting a space mission too early and returning home to Earth, the mother planet, without completing those explorations. Look at this. Part 1. Templeton Morris, for his part, was attempting to explain his position, all of which involved going back in time. A nose cone streaked through the heavens as this firmament gifted itself to abandonment. The craft is highly reminiscent of Thunderbird 3 or so, and it proves to be translinear, steely, +4, interconnected and sleek. It gusted along without momentum, and its endpoint obeys a stanchion, a piece of metal put up over time, even a box set. A blast of steam serves at its rear as this bird nears the apex of its discharge, for the unnamed planet above our adventure, or will, is sighted afar off. Likewise, the atmosphere susurrates about. It transposes on naught, and savours of nebulous gases. These acts so as to prevent ramifications with the heavens. Tendrils of smoke, ash, or space filter clog the way, and they ripple over the surface like chlorine, abundantly. Thus, each spiral explains its loss, as we notice different densities within the blackness. Space has many dimensions, if you will. These were the limitations of a Platonic idealism. Do you credit it? Anyway, one is free to spot, with or without a telescope, a kaleidoscope of planets, vapor, cosmic dust and rays, asteroids, comets, or stillbirths. Did they have lagoons or ports of entry, as regards an uncompleted J.G. Ballard story? Still, the nebulous above the planet gave off Thanatos' wheel, and it spoke of many ideas within ancestral memory. Again, no matter how fuzzy its immensity, we note that the firmament hides its story. It stretches one beaker beyond another's lip, yet, in all honesty, what serves notice to us is a lit-up flare, the like of which causes a cauldron to billow. May it be crossways? Our dart-like spaceship passes through it. Templeton Morris craft is about to land on the planet, and some of his men move to their environmental stations. Part 3. Once landed on this planet, the exploration began, and some of the men called up to the captain via an open hatch. He looks down on their heads from above, whilst dressed in his 50s vintage suit. Since doesn't this tale have about it a whiff of the 50s, and fantasia thereof? A ladder, steely and upright, has descended to the planet's surface, and the men busy themselves with experimental tasks. Templeton Morris gazes down on them from above, and occasionally he notices some tall, thin stalks. They protrude from the ground. They seem to be cut off midway, and their shadows take after a cave's wondrous resource, albeit turned down. Do you see? This computes with those flashes that turn sideways, often grafting to pink or adopting intermediate colours. These were grey, pebble dash, one rear dosage in a mirror, and bloodied scarlet. Also, such talk drew attention to the surface, namely, the fact that it's dimpled, raw, calcified, pinkish, and gives a pericarp's index. Templeton Morris tells his men to continue the hunt, and they move sideways in order to obey. Yet again, an effulgence appears on the orb's skin, and this must be to do with its nascent quality. No one, including the commander, has decided to name it yet. Part 4. Whilst exploring the planet, Morris and his men come across assemblages of bindweed, or tough grass. They inundate the surface of this ball, so as to provide it with a feather dustering or hide. Yes, he and his men make a route through it, so as to avoid tearing up reddish pigmentation by the roots. Let's say it, the very oddness of this circle gives it a dutifulness, the later not likely to lead to vengeful thoughts. Perversely, the men appear to be happy here, almost as if it's a home from home. To match it out, such bean poles lie low, or refuse to, and they come over as tough, flexible, inbred, flexional and tensile. All in all, though his men have a reluctance to harm them, never mind make a bonfire of them. Part 5. Occasionally the men get down on their hands and knees so as to examine the world's porous foam. On closer inspection, its eider down takes after a covering or erasure. This is one that stabilizes itself, touching. Do you see? The extravagance of its contact with your hand causes it to spring back again, rather like a piece of embroidery. Also, a sequence of lines or measuring rods festoon the planet, They cover it up gradually, indeed. Not 1 square inch of its surface is without these hatching wires. And in truth, they provide a tripwire over the facts, independent of its skim, and whatever they might be. All of a sudden, they become aware of a rumble in the earth's intestines, or otherwise deep in its guts. None of them evince any fear, but they are rendered weary, or uncertain if earthquakes happen to be coming. Likewise, the exploration party, whom Templeton Morris sent out, report back that there were more tremors amidships, even though they didn't eventuate in any spills, destruction, or fissures. To be sure, the tightness of the place seems inviolable, at least when looked at one way. While Templeton Morris speaks to his men, all of whom are armed for any eventuality, another report shakes this planet's surface. Maybe it takes after a non-metaphorical outburst, rather like accounts of godly vengeance in Aeschylus' Prometheus. This was a prose poem if ever there was one. All Templeton Morris can do, by way of contrast, is to have his men scour the topsoil once more, so as to penetrate into the inner mysteries. A few of those stalks, head high if they troubled a man, limn the distance next to their commander's face as he gives his orders. Bizarrely, another device from Brian Clemens' thriller occurs in our story. It has to do with a want of imagination, au contraire, as well as a superfluity of things elsewhere, do you see? For a large crater, gap or husk has moved across the tundra during the night, so as to reposition itself next to the spacecraft. It must have been a good 200 yards closer in, from where Templeton Morris marked its bearings. How can this aperture be described? Well, it has to do with a gaping hole, a reverse promontory, or its fixed bias. This can cause it to fall over occasionally. Might it be laughing at some sort of still life, no matter how unforgiven? Since this deep gash or surface crater surrounded by its bitten-off forethought chewed the cud, it lurked after so many semblances. Also, it led out the markings of many choice offerings. Do you understand? This was the case until Templeton Morris gave his cry, without explanation, to vacate the planet with all speed. The men, who were used to obeying him instinctively, paused for a moment before racing up the gangplanks. As mentioned earlier, and in the late 21st century, these were steel struts or ladders, in order to vacate any rendezvous. Soon the rocket has blasted off from this rocky orb in the starry gulf, nor did Templeton Morris furnish his men with an explanation. All he would repeat over the intercom again and again was the phrase, "We're returning to Earth." Not even the first mate, an old colleague, can elicit more of an answer. Part 6. Back at the court-martial, the wing commander eyes him more warmly than before. He seems, as well, to be slightly more hesitant, at least in terms of critical judgments, barbs or critiques. Barrington Moore Jr. is dressed ornately, as before, and a large or digital photo of Saturn exists behind him. It especially shows up the famous moon, Titan. Again, Templeton Morris, with a burst of enthusiasm he'd not shown before, begged to disagree with his august sentinel. "I did complete my mission," he declared with gusto and aplomb. Nothing like a denial will pass his lips, as both he and his commander soak up the shadows. Do the green curtains, heavy with felt, cause the room to be plunged in gloom? "I did complete my mission," declares the former and perhaps current space explorer. "After our return from outer space, I named the planet Vita in Latin, meaning life, and I intimate this most sincerely, Wing Commander, because those tufts on its surface were hair, the cross-hatchings took the form of paws, and the gigantic crater was its mouth. I didn't want my men to find out whether the crevasse had teeth or not. Do you observe this? For Vita is truthfully a fetal world. It abuts with renewed life. Let's recognize that the loud thump oscillation or upstart, was an ecosystem's heart beating most distinctly. It is alive, sir, and by any reckoning, I did finish my task to discover life in another solar system. Not guilty was the unanimous verdict of the disciplinary panel as they followed the lead of their chairman. But the bald wing commander, Barrington Moore, is no longer to be found numbered among the judges. He has already crossed over, in that he went around the smooth table as quickly as he could to shake hands. Soon both he and Templeton Morris were hand in glove. "Well done, my boy," was what the older man declared. Well, what do you think of that one? Quite interesting and quirky prose style, I think you'll agree. But also quite a fun story, I quite enjoyed it. Pretty imaginatively rendered, let's say. Once again, before we get into it, if you enjoyed that last story, if you wouldn't mind clicking the like button and subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. This next one is entitled Cycladic Torso, again by Jonathan Bowden. 1. A death-defying plunge needs no circus to restrain it. It merely cascades from a biplane at 10,000 feet. A travelling circus with its big top might make the difference, but an escape artist doesn't need the expense. Most certainly, large numbers of spectators have gathered under an awning. Yet the full panoply of vaudeville wasn't required. They'd come to see the leap of Bromack's Life Aid. The escapologist, who'd gathered this stunt to his advantage. Let's not forget, with a crowd of 20,000 paying £10 each, why, less a few costs, his wallet would be 200,000 the richer. Bromack's a lithe and gymnastic man stood on his biplane's tail. He was busy talking to some local reporters. They were, alternatively, exasperated and enthralled. How could this daredevil survive such feats? Wasn't there a Marvel comic strip called Daredevil? Besides, in any event, the gossip went around. Why didn't he retire? He'd already staged 10 of these shows, contained in circus literature, so he must be a millionaire. Why continue then? Such was the tittle-tattle around this biplane as it stood on the grass. The craft had recently bounced along to a negligent stop. His co-pilot, Bromide, a minor figure in his life, already had the rotary blades fizzing. They moved limpidly through the air, each one a handsaw, possibly reflecting future violence. The rest of the craft, given its modernity, was modelled on ancient forms, and its livery was green and gold. To be honest, it gave off a whiff of Harry Houdini, or lesser variants, Dark Madness, etc., and its fuselage was brightly polished. An upside-down V or triangle in reverse was painted on its side, whereby to wax Freudian, indicating the anti-death instinct. Might it be an example of Norman O. Brown's forgotten text, Life Against Death, from the 1950s? Few of the crowd, all of whom flocked to see the show, were concerned by such niceties. They were drawn by a more avid stench, that is, an expectation of demise, constriction, morbidity, or sadism. It always hangs around the thrall of mass art, like a freak show or circus of horrors, since it impinges on physiology. An experience such as this goes directly onto the nervous system. In other words, it feeds on neurasthenia, what the Victorians called nervous exaltation. 2. To begin with, Bromax was dressed in a suit which covered him from head to toe, yet its colour was violent red. Its scarlet inevitably drew all eyes to him as he bounced up and down on the tail's wing, especially given a contrast between mauve and emerald. If you recall, the biplane, in a slight nod to the Irish tricolour, was green and gold. It lost itself over the immense surface, and at times it was as if the public pavilions weren't there. To be sure, he needed a paying public for business purposes, yet underneath it all, they proved to be heedless, even unnecessary, since the nature of these jumps was solipsistic, and they revolved upon themselves psychologically. You see, with his conscious mind, these were commercial enterprises, little different from Zippo's circus, to be frank. But in all honesty, deeper resources are at work. These involve the auto de fe, as depicted in Spanish medieval art. Nor can we say that the modern saunders such displays, albeit in an attenuated form. Quod the hunger for sensation lingers on, most especially in the hearts and minds of the masses. This is why a shadow exists next to the circus and other arts, nor should one bridle at the term art, for in truth all of these conceits rely on popular artistry. They are the low arts, if you will. One can see this in Russia, for example, where circus is treated with high seriousness. Moreover, its best practitioners often end up with state pensions or flats. They elicit the right contention or bribe, you see? Given this, all of the following formula partake of an artistic vision. All of this involves strong men, fortune-tellers, acrobats, jugglers, remnants of the troubadours, knife-throwers, magicians, high-wire performers, animal tamers, clowns, and multiples thereof, mountebanks, contortionists, body artistes, escapologists, ringmasters, sideshow barkers, tent managers, and impresarios, fire-eaters, Punch and Judy professors, stilt-walkers or long toms, masters of eloquence, and music hall vaudeville and its alternatives, etc. This is best seen in the prospect of their intellectualization. It doesn't matter if we make use of Beckett's theatre or Brenton's, and this can involve masks, mock vaudeville, as well as characters at the Electric Cinema, Notting Hill Gate. This relates to Brenton's treatment of Christie, never mind Beckett's couple by the seaside, and they were buried up to the necks in sand. It all subsisted under one title, Happy Days. 3. A daredevil leap, such as this one, needed no introduction outside itself, as Bromax dived down to a certain demise, or at the very least, a secret part of his spectatorship hoped for this. Maybe it was what the future foretold. Yet wait a moment, for all this misses a diabolical gleam in his eye, something which has little to do with the suit that caparisons his body. Did we mention it a while back? Well, it covered his anatomy in a skin-hugging way. What with 2 horns plus an imaginary or suspended tail, it was his Red Devil outfit, so to say, i.e. what we might call his equivalent of the aeronautics team. As he dived, the American namesake would be dove, down. Various thoughts raced through his heated brain, yet even as he parted company with the biplane above the cerulean, his partner Bromide steered the craft safely to port. Bromac's life aid continued to plummet down amidships, and yet, as he did so, he was aware of various or distant stirrings. These took on the habits of forgotten dreams, where a screeching coda of gulls lay up over the summer sun. It burned deep into the country's tundra, if only to turn over the meaning of this baleful light, all of which occurred against a bright yellow dawn, one that saw a golden effulgence, even the talent of Zeus. As young Bromax raked away at the leaves in the extended garden, his aunt rested under a parasol in the distance, since the sun beat down with a merciless measure. Do you see? Do you sense in its extravagance here? Because the optics of such a fusion were always dissimilar. They reared up between these brittle leaves, so as to show up the way home, or maybe this was the origination of his deathly fascination. Whether it be here in the garden or no, in the distance, under an ormolu casket, and constantly struck yellow, a sheaf of brambles passed, so as to close up a gap in the vegetation. Between these many strokes, or permanent pastures, stood a scarecrow. Its ragged necklace dilated against the gold, and its pattern came to be fortune by turn. It consisted of rags, stalks, old clothes, avant-garde trimmings, and the findings of a hat. It curved back on itself. Conically speaking, what was Bromax's abiding interest in this sentinel? It may soon become apparent. 4. Bromax continued his descent, screaming or laughing, as if to all the world he were completely mad. Gradually, the biplane, flown by his colleague Bromide, disappeared into the distance. As he circled again and again, gymnastically amid the clouds, he knew one thing, and this was the chosen quality of fate. He understood whether he would survive this gamble or not. He sensed it with an inner certainty. Such a thought, a reversal of Greek predestination, made him shudder and laugh in his scarlet costume. He also became more and more aware of his younger self. That is, the one who insisted on watching him from the ground. Yes, indeed, this lonesome stranger followed 2 courses, one of which was contemporary. This involved an unscrupulous photographer who hid on the tundra amid the crowds and attendant dandies. They were drawn by the theatre of it, even the nascent thought of Sartre's no exit. Note this to say that the escapologist in a factotum's dream will not escape. Given this recording, he recognized his earlier incarnation, or carnate blossom, an ugly child, this, one who was avid for success, determined to watch a death scene and photograph it for the dailies. He intended to sell it to the highest bidder, most assuredly. This is even as he stood down in the crowd, collected together and surrounded by banners, streamers, weather balloons, dirigibles, and the fun of the fair. Yet Bromax's first version, or variant, took on a different course as well. In this simulacrum, the sun still burnt down before a mansion on the south coast. Wasn't its name Buddha, by any chance? Nonetheless, the scarecrow was lifted onto a mound of its own amid the lightning, and these thunder flashes were associated with dolorous rumbles. Didn't a murder of crows descend via the horizon and across the beetling prospect of so much rain? They lit out afore this lost adventure, and the sky itself became creased under such a maelstrom. Bromax, as a stripling, remembers the bird's descent, even the descent of a crew of rooks. Each one screamed and whooped as it came down out of the sky that was azure and washed from tip to toe. The thunder, rain, and lightning shouldn't take away from the drama of the scene, however, since what really captures it is the scarecrow. For in all honesty, this straw man, tied to a flexible post, lies aslant of his own rigging, and he grips the moon's surface with tendrils of forgotten grace. These are branches that scratch against some forbidding glass, even though the scarecrow's form was slightly horizontal, veering to one side, brackish, broken up and purple, vaguely. Now though, the middle-aged Bromax is approaching the Earth's surface with alarming speed, and he mentally prepares himself for what is to come. 5. As in all moments of stress, time seems to stand still, becomes overcast, and the clocks go in reverse in unlocked or studied closets. Let's see. Bromax had placed his hands together, almost in prayer, as his red-hued body nears the topsoil. By and by, he began to exert a perfect fall, trained in the circus as he was, and his hands extended over some welcoming ground. Wasn't it a trifle watery when one began to consider it afresh? Anyway, some redwoods, spruce, conifers, and other ancient trees surrounded the site. And wonder of wonders, do we detect an idiot grin on Bromax's features? Could he be about to meet his maker in any way possible? Who knows? But Bromax, even in a moment of pleasure, is not immune to the pull of his younger self. Doesn't he stand in front of the gable windows at Buda, down on the Kent coast, looking outward? And what does he see? Why, it happens to be the downwards cast of these crows, or its murder, depending on your pick. It's also characterized by the sea storm as it lashes the mansion's front above a lowering sky. Surely it looks out to the French coast, across the foaming channel. Do you detect it? Since the lightning forks down next to a vermilion blazon, while the rain streaks the hillock by the sea, all the manse's windows are open and burning orange, no matter how wide or mullioned in aspect. Similarly, the crows are attracted down to a spindly thing made of straw, that is, a scarecrow, with its claws splayed and its back to the ocean. It looks to all the world like a rare polka dot, even a grim reminder of the reaper's business, possibly a sprite or a witch's familiar. In any event, this silhouette seems to suck in rather than exclude the light. 6. To finish with his circus plunge, though, it appears from one perspective at least that Bromax is saying his prayers. The amphitheatre of his rage has extended, if only by a tiny amount, you see. Nonetheless, his scarlet suit was about to execute a pirouette, even the semblance of a dive from a board. Immediately, wavelets of water were churned up or tossed about, so as to prevent placidity on the lake's surface. For Bromax contrived it, that a shimmering glaze of water extended afore him, and this is what he catapulted into. He adopts a perfect 4 and dives into a cool, sterile, tangential pond, the like of which causes his body to freeze momentarily. This occurs even given the thermal character of the Red Devil suit. It didn't clog up with icy water in any event, given the body-hugging nature of its extravagance. Yet still and all, the scarecrow images from the past continue to stalk him, and they festoon his dreams, even his inner consciousness. For a miscellany of crows continues to streak down in front of Buddha, and with thunder's threat in their ears. Note, ever since Daphne du Maurier's The Birds, a gothic piece, a congery of fowl waxes sinister. Eventually, these birdies gather around the scarecrow, whipping, riding and screaming, sick amidst the rain. It, a watery deluge, continues to lash down, to evacuate or to render itself still. Moreover, the scarecrow looks on, lifelessly, to be sure, yet with a strange illumination. Might there be a red gleam, as if an iris, in its inner socket? Surrounded, as it was, by rind, sacking, and the livery of potato bags, these accompanied the remainder of his kit, such as a battered hat, an empty face, large, almost square eyes, and the imposition of a new inquisition. Why were the birds so attracted to this wretched specimen? No one could really tell, come to think of it. Maybe it had aught to do with the nasal sots or pheromones of wild fowl. These alone, when one considers it, can teach you the meaning of fear. Oh my, yes. Given this, Bromax threw himself about in the pool until he realized that he was being pursued by, of all things, a telephoto lens. It exists in the sweating palms of our drama's other character, a journalist and photographer by the name of Rex Silverdust. He was a young man, an apothecary of absence, wearing a check cap with a matching jacket. He is also kitted out avec a woolen scarf, the latter orange in hue. In truth, Silverdust had to hide his disappointment, for this example of Scot-free, so to say, has saved himself. He'd managed to prove his credentials as an escapologist, that is, a mountebank in Houdini's or Cogliostro's tradition. Do you sense a connection? Since Rex Silverdust, our rival persona in Aeschylus drama, had a private trauma to do with birds, in his case it involved being left alone in a purple outhouse or chapel as the birds came in. Could it have amounted to one of those proximate structures, out Buddha way, which have been left there in order to test the waters? To be sure, a broken gap in these trellises or railings on one side of the chalet caused it to tilt to the side, and made it capable of letting in the wild birds. They would come, if there was some magical device to summon them, and his iris extended. It knew the limitations of blue. A similar event, if we remember it, has to do with the whippoorwills and their antics in H.P. Lovecraft's stories of New England deceit. Slowly, oh so slowly, the crowd of birds descend on Silverdust, the object of his grandmother's wrath, and they peck at him, somewhat mercilessly. The isolation of a child in such circumstances can be imagined, and Silverdust, a talented individual, grew up warped in various ways. Why was he here anyway, if not to capture a performance artist's death throes? After all, he'd intended his report on this artistry to have been an obituary, replete with photos. The piece could have slewed in either direction, you see, whether towards the normative or the sinister. One only has to think of La Furas del Baus, Vermin from the Sewers, a Catalan art troupe whose work consisted of happenings. These were a species of negative circus, so to speak, and they were characterized by car crashes, races, mock crucifixions, and the consumption of offal. It refuses to circumscribe itself, even after the adoption of other identities. Irrespective of this, Silverdust remembers crouching in the dust, in the studio's dank underbelly, as the birds mount their attacks. To be fair, the outside of the structure speaks to an artist's studio, or the possibility of a writer's hut, even the device which George Bernard Shaw made use of. It exists as a sort of log cabin on the margins of his estate, once his fortune had been made. Shaw's corner, however, indicates imagination's limits, since the form was four-sided, peaked as to its roof, studied over, and only open to the elements at a slant, while, if viewed from the other side, the door appears to be more ornate or filigreed. It besports, albeit slightly, a token of regard or intent, even the possibility of pre-Raphaelite aesthetics. Look at this, if you will, since the doorway revealed an elevated portico, replete with Victorian pedigrees and various exotic motifs, reminiscent of Beckford's Vathek. Crowded in on every side, they sought to shut out the wooden struts beneath them, perchance so as to limit any storytelling outside. All of these narratives occur in the mind. By any dexterity, this is the point. Whether we wish to disturb those ghosts down by Buda and out on the Kent coast. To return to the present tense, Bromax took a long, hard look at his companion before speaking. Then he said without circumspection, "Don't be too disappointed, Rex, and do not go and start either at the very fact or temerity which has given you your name. Yes, indeed, I have survived. It was fated, or in the stars. But don't worry. If you like, I will give you access to my secret as to why I can survive these death leaps. Let's meet for dinner tonight. Shall we rendezvous at a restaurant called Brighansi's in Soho's Poland Street, London, W1. It has a large Grecian torso outside and a boudoir of steel wire. It is almost a combination of modernism, classicism, and Soviet realism. I'll see you later at a table inside the front window at 7:30 p.m. Be there." The journalist could merely stammer his acknowledgement. Then this inveterate showman gave the young man a card. It read, "Bromax Life Aid, Escapologist Extraordinaire. Indestructible?" 7. They met at a popular restaurant later on, and were shown to a leading bay. This was next to the windows and overlooked the street. The eatery existed in a highly fashionable part of West London, and Bromax swept away the reservation card with the back of his hand, as he managed to rescue the situation, socially speaking, by slipping a £10 note into the waiter's palms. Yet still in all, various images of their past continued to haunt both Bromax Life Aid and Rex Silverdust. Nearly all of them revolve around one memory, and this relates to a book out of place among others, and contained on a library's shelves. Might it be one of those black-bound recesses in Buda, up from a pebble beach on the Kent coast? Hythe was the town where this house became vacant by sea, while the volume in question is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. How can this be relevant, you ask? But already, the moment's gone and Bromax resumes talking about his secret. This is the knack that enables him to coin deathly exploits. 8. Bromax held up a strange watch in his hand, but it was in no way a wristwatch. At first sight, it looked like an advanced stopwatch with a gold frontispiece, a chain and multiple dials. Behind Bromax there curve various restaurant lamps, themselves curlicued, golden, ormolu, and left over. "This is the secret of my success," confided Bromax, and it was bequeathed to me by Giant Falstaff, the artiste and escapologist, just before he died. He'd also been an all-in wrestler earlier in his career. Silverdust seems to be unconvinced by this démarche, yet Bromax proves to be very convincing. The dial itself consists of 5 spirals, all of them indicating distinct figures or numbers. These sigils were magical in quality, however, and they limit a death watch. That is, they illustrate various marks, speeds, and avenues, for this device, passed across generations of escapologists, determines the very hour of one's death. It does it in terms of the day, hour, past minute, and forgotten instant of the year. By making use of it, therefore, Bromax has managed to escape negativism, i.e., an untimely end via a violent fall or constriction. For these types, certainly, life can begin and end in a captured box. Such events disclose only the finitude of H.P. Lovecraft's The Loved Dead, and it hints at a claustrophobia raised in the nth power. But other dreams were set off by these associations, particularly the fact that Bromax's life aid wound the watch for every stunt, just to prove whether his number had come up. In one moment, the two of them remembered suggestive motes, most of which related to the house known as Buda on the Kent coast. One apprehends it through salty spray, and yet, in all honesty, the spirit of Derek Jarman's property down at Dungeness possesses it. To be sure, we walk through Death's Valley into a new darkness, and the odd opening to the elements pokes up via the roof. Can it be patched up in its magnificence? Anyway, the manse lay open before a lowering sky, and it raised those beams to the heavens out of a red mist. Most of its accoutrements were Edwardian, even neo-Victorian, and they lavished some forgotten, possibly Rhodesian days. There were many brown photographs around for the two of them, showing them in the care of their grandmother. Ungodly moose. She stood between them in an old dress, and within a frame of rolled gold. Could Buda really be a freak house? Even an arboretum or an aviary? Who knows? It was open to the elements, dishevelled and hallowed, and refuses to answer back. A complex webbing, or its distaff, covered over Buda's top, and no light can follow from such an unlikely taper. Various dreams, tropes, sigils, and forgotten grandeurs linger on, and these became possessed by a new fear. Can it be the fresh immensity of a skull in the ground? For it had been dug up by rising water levels, propelling it to the surface, nothing more. Also, does anyone remember the birds coming in? Screeching, ravening, screaming, hollering, and creating a racket. They descend via an orange wreck, and all of it resembles the dark, boiling turquoise of a volcano. It was an Etna in reverse, even though the birds carom down like storks, or alternatively some indices in a modernist painting by Michaud, where the marks are the corroboration of what exists. May this signify aught? Meanwhile, and back in the restaurant, the story is repeated. Bromax talks about the death watch, or unholy stopwatch, and Silverdust is skeptical about it. Might this surfeit of horrors be down to a timepiece in a man's hand? 9. Bromax continues to speak about the stopwatch. It was quite clearly one of his prized possessions, and neither man, whether the escapologist or the stripling, can forget other dreams which affront them. These involve waking up at midnight in order to hear the rain coming down outside Buda. It's part and parcel of those storms that disfigure the south coast. No one really vouchsafes for it, not now at least, since a reddish light was open across a louvered roof and in a new room. Sleep proved impossible. Once it had been so forcibly removed, gradually, either of these two men, when they were young, set out to investigate. They closed down their own offertory's path, primarily by topping off the stair level. Would they close in on the step's bottom, given that the entrance in its grandeur speaks to Erich von Stroheim's 20s films? It understands the nature of class or distinction, even in an enclosed space like Buddha. It is now or never in a restaurant of life and death, and Bromax was still discussing his stopwatch, as well as its contribution to Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus, or perchance this illustrates any other circus novels that you might wish to discuss, such as Ray Bradbury's, or, in spirit, Edgar Allan Poe's. What about J.G. Ballard's Vermilion Sands, or Beckett's Happy Days, as sojourns in popular culture, by making use of brutality and the sinister? 10. Suddenly, a brace of machine gun bullets cut across the restaurant, hitting Bromax and causing him to catapult into the air. He crashes down onto the table, drags its cloth and disappears underneath it. The violence was completely unexpected, and might it relate, uncertainly, to the reservation that the escapologist had stolen away? Now then, much of the eatery's front had been destroyed. Women were screaming, and a police siren sounds in the distance. Also, and despite the fact that chairs were hurled about, Rex Silverdust emerges unscathed from his ordeal. He notices whether Bromax Life-Aid's fingers are wrapped around his special watch as well. His bloodied mittens enclose it in a vice-like grip, and the clock seems to have stopped at a particular instant. The journalist strove to investigate. It was his profession, after all. 11. Silverdust paused slightly, coughed, and picked up the watch. It had definitely stopped at a particular time, but it didn't appear to be broken or smashed as a result of its ordeal. Moreover, the mobsters, two of them, who had fired on Bromax Life-Aid, realized their mistake. They'd meant to target a rival gangster who'd reserved the same table. If you recall, Bromax had done his best to alleviate that. Now the stopwatch declared 8:35 p.m. Sunday the 15th of March 1983, the exact moment when Bromax Life-Aid, escapologist, slipped off his last skin. At first, Silverdust, a lustful character, was amazed at the correspondence, yet, gradually, he began to see the possibilities. He might be able to replace Bromax Life-Aid by virtue of this dimension-changing alternative. May it be so? He stared avidly at the death watch in his palm. Could this be the source of a worldly fortune, as it had been initially for Bromax? Indeed, the keenness with which he looked at the timepiece, his lividness, acuity, and watchfulness made people think he was sympathizing with Bromax's plight. In fact, he was dwelling on his own advantage. Yet first, he would have to determine the hour of his own demise. Unbeknownst to those around him, he cleaned and then clicked the stopwatch into life, and slowly, jerkily, it responded. Around and around the 5 dials moved, all in relative correspondence to each other, and finally, this dialectic ceased. Did it not intone a dance of skeletons, imaginatively, around a set of empty chairs? They were topped with felt and tassels, to be sure. The watch stopped, after a few half measures, at an indeterminate date. It was a good 50 years off. Rex Silverdust swallowed, and then turned exultant, his fist clasped and unclasped in triumph. Moreover, the stripling's face is exhilarated and challenged, fitful, amoral, and beyond caring. This was the key to his triumph. All of this relates to a previous dream involving his grandmother, for had she not risen from the earth, a skeleton in an old-fashioned dress, the hair trailed off her skull in a bun, yet remained somehow present over the barren cranium. This always resolved itself in the script, or bony affidavit of a skull. Hadn't she lifted herself from the ground in order to persecute the living by her own effort? The word Rex seems to hang or sibilate on her bony lips, while the hands were elongated, skeleton, as well as fingering or delving into the sand. Wasn't Buda the old homestead next to a sandy beach which ran alongside a pier on its frontage? Some bath huts or houses for swimmers were also in evidence, yet Rex, without Bromax, has no real time to scream, since her strength seems inhuman, in that she had burrowed up from the earth, denying the sod's forbidding texture. Events move quickly now, and Rex Silverdust promptly reinvents himself as an escapologist or daredevil. He dispensed with the circus elements and modernized the show. Eventually, a large grandstand with a Ferris wheel behind it took him up, and he successfully stood on a wall of flame or had piles of fireworks lit underneath him. The audience lapped it up, although some of the stunts were decidedly dangerous and without benefit of health and safety. For dress or accoutrements, he wore an overall bodysuit in black. It was rather reminiscent of a racing driver, particularly of motorcycles. After each successful tourney, Rex lives to tell the tale, and yet his eyes begin to glow preternaturally. He is clearly getting madder in terms of an inner debility, and, occasionally, the old dream of the grandmother's corpse coming up from the earth haunted him. It suggested the bias of a new fulfillment, the likelihood of which carries forth a new charnel house. It crossed its own bows, you see, before the nature of this oblivion. Let's look again, since she moves up from the loam, so as to cling to a red silhouette amid the black. It all rested on a supposition of absence, even though an infrared camera might reveal the reality of what went before. In one of the Incredibles' showtimes, however, he rammed a flaming car containing himself into a mesh fence. He escaped unscathed, as heretofore, and as the stopwatch had predicted, yet a spark or ingot escaped from the vehicle and damaged the front of the auditorium, where a female spectator was sitting. No one thought about it at the time, certainly not Silverdust, who had no compassion for his audience whatsoever. Nevertheless, as he sat in his open Rolls-Royce one day, in a fashionable western district, a man gained revenge on him by throwing a live grenade into his car. There was an almighty explosion, yet Rex remained secure in the belief that he would survive it. Needless to say, he did so in a devastated manner. That is, as an example of Dalton Trumbo's Johnny Got His Gun, whereby his diction, physiologically, was reduced to that of a head and a partial torso without limbs or other extremities. He isn't the Incredible, his stage name, in any sense now, and his skull was completely bandaged after the affectation of H.G. Wells's The Invisible Man. There happened to be a space only for the eyes, nose, and lips. Although the chief doctor, in the case, when discussing it, referred to the strange stopwatch that had been discovered with the corpse, albeit one which was alive, the stopwatch predicted a date later that day. Despite the fact, which says that Rex's demise remains a half-century off, could it refer to the bewhiskered surgeon? Or more precisely, might Rex's grandmother rise from the dirt to predecease him? She may put those bony or skeletal fingers around his neck and press, or alternatively, she will pursue him out of Buda and toward the sea down by the coast and amid the circling gulls. These cried out with the savagery of nether beasts. After all, she had been related to both of them over time. Bromax Life Aid and Rex Silverdust, depending. Well, there you have it, guys. Pretty esoteric, pretty surreal in lots of ways. But nevertheless, a pretty clever little story with some lovely fan service, although perhaps it wouldn't have been considered fan service in those days. But yeah, lots of nice mentions of some of our favourite authors like H.G. Wells and, of course, H.P. Lovecraft. So yeah, there we go. A couple of little stories there from Jonathan Bowden. I hope you enjoyed them. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, all that good stuff. So thanks so much for listening. I will see you in the next one. I'm Christian Bravery, and you have been listening to Savage Bites.